I'd like to invite you to close your eyes just for a moment. Once your eyes are closed, I'd like you to picture a person with a severe mental illness. What would that person look like? Now open your eyes. Did you picture me? I didn't always live with a mental illness. My childhood and early adulthood were normal. I finished college, and I started working in my early 20s. Then I switched tracks, and I joined the Peace Corps and served successfully in Gabon, Africa for 2 years. Traveling through West Africa on my way home from the Peace Corps, I stopped to visit a friend deep in the bush of Togo, Africa. After a day of visiting, for the first time in my life, I stayed up all night just thinking. I was thinking about my life and where I'd been, and I could see the patterns clearer than ever before. And as the night wore on, my thinking went faster and faster and more global. And just before dawn, for the first time in my life, a voice appeared in my head. And the voice said, "You're thinking along the right directions. I want to teach you more." Well, that sounded like an adventure, so I listened to the voice. And I fell into a catatonic state. When my friend couldn't wake me, he somehow strapped my catatonic body to the back of his motorcycle, and he drove me to the nearest population center, where we got a bush taxi, and he drove me to the capital city, to the Peace Corps office there. The Peace Corps and the American Embassy argued over who was responsible for me. And in the end, they picked the least cost option, a local asylum for the insane called Benderville in the Ivory Coast. After 3 days, I woke up, and I was locked in with patients who had markings on their faces, on their arms and their legs from the work of medicine men. I was locked away far from family and friends. I had a series of adventures between the time I was committed to Benderville to the time about a half month later when I walked in the kitchen door of my home in Pennsylvania. The short version is that the American Embassy hired a Western psychiatrist to come to Benderville. And in Benderville, the psychiatrist determined that I was completely lucid. And that led the way to my release. The American Embassy was able to arrange 2 tickets for me back to the United States, one for me and one for an accompanying nurse. But before that American Embassy official made those arrangements, he molested me in his office. And I think he felt completely safe doing that, because after all, who believes a woman, let alone one who is certifiably crazy? But back to my story. So I made it back to the United States, back to Pennsylvania. And I started to try and get my bearings and figure out what had happened. But just 2 weeks after I arrived home, I had another incident. And this time, there were no voices. It was just a slow decrease of my ability to think. It was like a computer loading RAM, only backwards. 80% of capacity, 60, 40, 20. At 10%, I could no longer understand English. And at 0%, I was lost in my own internal world. And that began my journey with mental illness, with what was eventually diagnosed as bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder is a mental illness characterized by extreme swings of mood. I have bipolar 1, the more severe kind, that can involve interruptions of thinking and psychosis. Bipolar is treatable, and over time, I found a mix of medications that could stop the extremes of the illness. And though it was not always a smooth road, over the next 25 years, lots of good things happened. I finished graduate school. I found professional work. I married the love of my life, and I raised 2 kids. But my medication strategy came at a huge cost. Every morning I woke up with a terrible drug hangover. I was depressed and low energy. I lived my life in a drug-induced cloud. When my daughter turned 18, I decided I wanted more out of my medication strategy than just avoiding psychosis. I wanted to not only survive my mental illness, I wanted to thrive. I wanted to have good, positive energy again. I wanted to be happy, and I wanted to have some joie de vivre. Well, I did it. I learned to live well with a mental illness, something that for years I thought was impossible. Now, in a typical 30-day period, I might have one day of the month where I have some depression or anxiety, but 30 out of 31 days, I have good, positive energy. I feel happy again, and I've found a sense of joie de vivre. So how do I do it? How did I learn to live well with a mental illness? Well, in my memoir, I identify 13 strategies that I use to live well with a mental illness. Today, I'd like to consolidate those top strategies into 3 key tools. I call it my toolkit for bipolar disorder. This toolkit might also be helpful to people with other mental illnesses. And some tools might be helpful for people who don't have a mental illness, but would just like to live life a little healthier mentally. The first tool in my toolbox for bipolar disorder is to identify and interrupt unhealthy thinking patterns. I've noticed that psychoses start with small unhealthy thoughts that take root and grow. I've learned to watch for thoughts that come too fast or take up too much room in my brain. I use daily meditation to monitor my thinking. I've also used meditation to identify techniques to interrupt those thoughts once I've identified them. For example, slow in and out breathing can calm a racing thought. Another technique I use to interrupt thoughts is to simply repeat a one-word mantra over and over. My second most important tool in my toolbox for bipolar disorder is a flexible medication plan. And what I mean by that is I take extra medication only when I need it, as opposed to taking large, heavy doses every day, as is typically prescribed for bipolar. If I can't interrupt a thought with meditation and breathing, I take a drug called Zyprexa to calm my brain for me. If I take Zyprexa when my thoughts are taking just a little bit too much room in my brain, it only takes a little medication to bring my brain back to center. If I were to wait for that same thought to cascade into psychosis, it would take major doses of medication over several days to bring my brain back to center. And that's my secret. I nip unhealthy thoughts in the bud. They never have the chance to grow and cascade into mania or depression. For example, back in Africa on that first psychosis, I look back now and I can see warning signs. Before I heard that voice, my thinking went faster and faster. Now, if my thinking escalated like that, I would intervene immediately. The other component to my flexible medication plan is I take extra medications if needed for sleep. The great thing about a flexible medication plan is that I live on a much lower dose of daily medications than I used to. And that means much lower side effects. My brain is so much clearer than it used to be. I must include a warning here. Medication plans can only be changed under the direct supervision of a mental health professional. Sudden changes in medication can be dangerous. In addition, before a flexible medication plan can be launched, the bipolar person must be able to identify and interrupt unhealthy thoughts and be committed to taking extra medication when needed. A flexible medication plan is not for everyone, but it's made all the difference for me. My third most important tool in my toolbox for bipolar disorder is to every day work towards building a healthier brain. Our brains are not static organs. We do not have to accept the state we find our brains in today as a given for the rest of our lives. With focused action, we can build new neural pathways that can launch a brain from an unhealthy state like depression into a more centered, healthier state. Are you depressed? Do you ever feel low energy? Would you like a healthier brain? Neuroscientists say exercise more. I exercise 6 times a week, and in addition, I try to do a 2 or 3 hour long exercise a couple times a month, and I enjoy a calmer brain after exercise. Another thing I do every day to build a healthier brain is I start off with specific goals in mind for the day, and in the evening, I celebrate those that I've accomplished. Also, at the end of the day, I go back and try and find 3 things to be grateful for. Neuroscientists have found that the process of scanning the brain, finding things to be grateful for, is one of many specific things you can do that light up those areas of the brain involved in depression. I want to make one more point related to building a healthier brain. And for that, I want to go back for a minute, back to Benjerville. I have a telex from the US Embassy that describes Benjerville as an institution similar to the psychiatric institutions back in the 1940s. Even though Benjerville was backward in so many ways, it was advanced in at least one way. Every single patient at Benjerville, except me, had a family member staying with them 24/7 to offer comfort, connection, and safety. Africans understand the incredible power of family to help heal the mentally ill. Our brains are wired for social connection. I reach out to family and friends on a daily basis. I am crystal clear that if I hadn't had family to come home to when I was so sick after the Peace Corps and throughout my illness, that I would be one more mentally ill person on the streets and probably dead by now. I know that there are mentally ill that no matter how many medications they take or how big their toolbox is, they won't experience wellness. Their illnesses are too severe. However, I believe there are so many others who could use my toolbox for bipolar disorder to substantially improve the quality of their lives. People who could join me when I say, I have a mental illness and I am well. Thank you.